US President Donald Trump's abrupt cancellation of a state visit in 2 weeks' time.
So Trump recently said that he wants Canada, Greenland, and the Panama Canal to join the United States.
It came after Mr. Trump floated the prospect of the US buying the autonomous Danish territory of Greenland.
What if the next global conflict isn't in the South China Sea, the Middle East, or Eastern Europe, but beneath the icy plains of Greenland? In early 2025, the world watched in disbelief as former President Donald Trump, newly re-elected and emboldened, stood before Congress and declared America's intent to annex Greenland, a territory traditionally seen as off-limits. At first, the world laughed. After all, Trump's 2019 comments about buying Greenland were treated as a joke. But this time, he wasn't joking. And this time, the stakes weren't just about land. It was about minerals, power, and military dominance in the rapidly thawing Arctic. Real quick, if you're into videos that cut through the noise and break things down clearly, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps more people find this, and if you're not subscribed yet, now's a good time. We've got more deep dives coming your way. Also, drop a comment and let me know what you think. I'd love to hear your take. Now, onto the video. But as Trump laid out his plans with bombast and aggression, Canada quietly executed a masterstroke. In collaboration with the European Union and Greenland's own leadership, it sealed a $3 billion mining deal, one that gave it a direct stake in Greenland's rare earth minerals and shut the US out of the equation. In less than 6 months, Greenland went from being Trump's fantasy to Canada's strategic triumph, and in the process, the Arctic was transformed from a frozen frontier into the centre of a global power struggle. This is the untold story of how Canada beat America in a 21st century geopolitical chess match, without firing a single shot. When then-President Trump casually suggested buying Greenland in 2019, most world leaders shrugged it off as another one of his off-the-cuff remarks. Greenland, after all, is a semi-autonomous territory under the Kingdom of Denmark. The idea that a modern Western nation could be bought, like some 19th century colonial transaction, seemed absurd. But Trump never forgot the idea. Fast forward to November 2024. After clinching a stunning political comeback, Trump returned to office with a vengeance, and with a list of unfinished dreams. During his victory speech, he revisited old promises, a steel wall on the US-Mexico border, peace in Ukraine, and then, unexpectedly, he added a new priority: Greenland. The political class was stunned. But the real shock came in March 2025, when Trump addressed Congress again, this time boldly proclaiming, "We will annex Greenland to the United States, one way or another." The words echoed across diplomatic circles like a thunderclap. But this time, Trump wasn't simply making noise. The National Security Council began reviving Cold War-era Arctic documents, specifically the Arctic Gap Identification Protocol, once used during the Eisenhower era, and a radar modernization draft from the 1980s. These documents laid the groundwork for military presence, leasing agreements, and even implied long-term ownership. The US rationale, at least publicly, was based on military needs. Greenland's northern coast offered a strategic advantage over Russian ballistic submarines that could otherwise blind US radar systems in Alaska. But open-source analysts and military experts saw through the narrative. The real motive wasn't military, it was mineral. Greenland contains some of the richest untapped mineral deposits in the world, 38 billion tons of rare earth metals, essential for electronics, weaponry, and clean energy. On top of that, 17 billion barrels of Arctic oil. To the Trump administration, Greenland wasn't just real estate, it was economic national security. Senator Josh Hawley from Missouri said it plainly. If we don't mine these resources, Beijing will. Trump's team began lobbying hard for Senate support, positioning the Greenland acquisition as a necessity to counter both Russia and China. But in doing so, Trump made one critical mistake. He awakened opposition not only abroad, but also within. Denmark and Greenland swiftly rejected the idea. Greenland's Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen stated, "Greenland belongs to the Greenlanders." Copenhagen, Nuuk, and NATO allies saw the annexation attempt as neo-colonial, coercive, and destabilizing. But while Washington debated, argued, and postured, another nation was already playing the long game. While the US was caught up in loud declarations and power plays, Canada was quietly securing the winning move. In early 2025, two Canadian companies, Greenland Resources Inc. and Amarok Minerals, inked a massive deal worth $3 billion. The agreement was simple on paper, but monumental in impact. Canada, in coordination with the European Union and backed by Denmark's Export Credit Agency, would develop Greenland's vast deposits of rare earth metals and gold. It was everything the US wanted, done legally, diplomatically, and, most importantly, without a single shot being fired. But how did Canada pull this off? First, they understood the new rules of geopolitics. Investment is influence. Rather than trying to own Greenland, Canada offered something far more valuable: partnership. Their proposal wasn't one of domination, but of collaboration. They agreed to Greenland's sovereignty terms, including 70% local employment in all mining operations, 10% of profits redirected to Greenland's National Future Fund, modelled after New Zealand's sovereign wealth strategy, strict compliance with EU environmental and labour standards. For Greenland, this was a win-win: economic development, environmental sustainability, and political autonomy. For Canada, it was a strategic coup. Greenland Resources, once a modest molybdenum miner in Ontario, was reborn. It secured EU funding via the European Investment Bank's Green Fund and signed letters of intent that guaranteed Greenland's ores would flow directly to Europe's steel and defence industries. Amaroq Minerals, a Toronto-listed exploration company, focused on reviving the Nalanino gold deposit, a site previously abandoned due to harsh Arctic conditions. With help from Denmark's IPO, Norway's pension fund, and British and American private equity, ironically, Amaroq raised £45 million in record time. And here's the twist: much of the capital came from American sources, funneled through multinational funds. The US, in trying to dominate Greenland, ended up inadvertently funding its own exclusion. Washington was stunned. Unlike the US approach, which leaned on military pressure and outdated Cold War playbooks, Canada's strategy was modern, soft power diplomacy backed by cold, hard cash. And it worked. Greenland's cabinet swiftly approved a 30-year mining license, bypassing US firms entirely. But the real brilliance wasn't just in the deal itself, it was in what it prevented. With Greenland now tied economically to Canada and Europe, Trump's ambitions became legally and politically toxic. Any US interference could now be seen as aggression, not just against Greenland or Denmark, but against European investment interests. It was an elegant checkmate: no threats, no bluster, just decisive, well-funded action. And Canada didn't stop there. What Canada initiated, Europe expanded. Following the mining deal, the Arctic Green Transition Fund was born, a joint financial effort by Canada, the European Union, and Norway, amounting to $3.1 billion. Its mission: to finance Greenland's infrastructure, roads, energy grids, airports, and housing for mining towns. Notably excluded? All US institutions. That wasn't an oversight, it was a statement. This fund solidified Greenland's status as a multilateral hub, one tied economically and diplomatically to a network of Arctic allies. Trump's annexation rhetoric was now not only diplomatically embarrassing, but economically suicidal. Any US disruption in Greenland would jeopardize Canadian and European investments and fracture NATO unity. And NATO did, in fact, begin to fracture. Norway publicly backed Denmark's sovereignty stance. France deployed its nuclear submarine Sovereign to Baffin Bay in a subtle show of strength. Poland, careful to maintain defence ties with Trump, remained silent. Meanwhile, Canada issued a stern diplomatic warning against any form of coercive resource extraction. Even Greenland's response was calculated. On March 12, 2025, its coalition government in Nuuk released a joint statement with Copenhagen. "We reject any sovereignty negotiations. Coercive tactics by foreign nations undermine the unity of NATO and violate the principles of Arctic cooperation." Behind closed doors, NATO members worried that Trump's aggressive stance might even trigger Article 5, the alliance's collective defence clause. If Denmark viewed the situation as a threat to its territorial integrity, it was a geopolitical nightmare in the making. Meanwhile, Canada moved with deliberate precision. While publicly supporting US Arctic military cooperation, it warned that annexation-style moves would force Canada to re-evaluate its own Arctic sovereignty doctrines, including the sensitive question of the Northwest Passage, a vital shipping lane currently claimed by Canada but contested by the US. In short, Trump's plan to dominate Greenland had triggered a diplomatic minefield. And as the US stumbled through it, Canada quietly emerged as the Arctic's new centre of gravity. So why did Trump want Greenland so badly? Why did Canada and the EU act with such urgency? It all comes down to what lies beneath the ice. Greenland is sitting on a treasure trove, over 38 billion tonnes of rare earth elements. We're talking about neodymium, praseodymium, graphite, zirconium, and niobium. These aren't just scientific tongue twisters, they're critical to the global economy. Rare earths power electric vehicles, smartphones, satellites, nuclear reactors, and hypersonic missiles. They are the backbone of both the green energy revolution and modern warfare. Control over these materials means control over the future. And Greenland, it's one of the last largely untapped sources on Earth. The US military knew this. Open source analysts from think tanks like RAND and CSIS had long pointed to Greenland's mineral potential. But they were ignored until China began dominating rare earth supply chains and Russia tightened its Arctic grip. By the time Washington paid attention, Canada had already moved in. The consequences were immediate and severe. The US Inflation Reduction Act, passed in 2022, had promised billions in subsidies for EV manufacturing, but required minerals to come from domestic or allied sources. At the time, it was assumed the US would gain access to Greenland's rare earths. Instead, with Canada and the EU now controlling access, Greenland was reclassified from potential to restricted in US defence supply chains. Molybdenum, a key material used in high-strength steel for electric vehicle bodies, nuclear submarines, and hypersonic glide vehicles, was suddenly in short supply. Defence contractors scrambled. Lockheed Martin delayed hypersonic weapon testing due to molybdenum shortages. Raytheon shifted contracts toward Australian and Chilean suppliers, but faced delivery delays. The Pentagon warned that 17% of all projected defence manufacturing in 2026 could face setbacks due to Arctic supply disruptions. This wasn't just a military concern, it was an economic one too. Automakers like Tesla, Ford, and General Motors, already struggling with raw material prices, found themselves locked out of key Greenland sources. The EU, however, was in a far better position. Having secured long-term contracts through its deal with Greenland Resources and Amarok Minerals. Meanwhile, Greenland's new policies ensured that profits stayed local. A July 2025 infrastructure law mandated 10% of all mining profits be deposited into a future fund, a sovereign wealth reserve designed to finance schools, hospitals, and clean energy projects for generations to come. This wasn't just mining, it was nation-building. The US, desperate to regain footing, offered new military leases and naval infrastructure deals to Greenland. But Nuuk rejected them. "We are not for sale," Greenland's leaders repeated, over and over. Instead of winning Greenland, the US had created a competitor alliance, one where Canada, the EU, and Greenland cooperated on defence, trade, energy, and Arctic sovereignty. The balance of power had shifted, and it was about to shift even more. And Greenland noticed. To gain favour with Washington, US companies attempted to submit bids for Greenlandic projects. But they refused to meet Greenland's terms: local labour quotas, environmental standards, and profit sharing. As a result, all bids were rejected. And those same firms watched as their Canadian rivals, funded by the same pools of capital, took the prize. Trump's aggressive rhetoric didn't help. Greenland's people, long sceptical of foreign influence, became even more resistant after hearing their homeland described as purchasable land. Their Prime Minister made it clear. Greenland is not a product on a shelf. We are a people, a culture, a history, and we decide our future. Back in Washington, pressure was mounting. In Congress, Alaska Senator Lisa Murkowski warned that escalating Arctic tensions could damage environmental protections and jeopardize American interests. A bipartisan group of senators from Maine and Vermont proposed a consensus Arctic strategy, one that emphasized diplomacy and mining partnerships over annexation or militarization. But it was too late. Greenland had already chosen its allies. The State Department tried to negotiate naval base rights at Thule Air Base in exchange for economic development support. But those talks collapsed when Nuuk and Copenhagen saw them as veiled attempts at coercion. Meanwhile, Canada unveiled its long-term Arctic development plan, the Arctic Hexagon. This blueprint connected Greenland's minerals with Baffin Island's iron ore, Nunavut's nickel fields, and space facilities run by NASA and the Canadian Space Agency. The plan didn't exclude the US, but it didn't require it either. Canada had positioned itself as a middle power, balancing between superpowers without being dependent on either. Energy played a role too. Once mocked as the subject of a real estate punchline, Greenland is now at the centre of a global power shift. What was once dismissed as a fantasy has become the fault line between ambition and strategy, between force and finesse. Donald Trump's bold declaration to annex Greenland was not just ignored, it was strategically neutralised. While he rallied headlines with bravado, it was Canada, quiet, methodical, and backed by a web of economic allies that captured the Arctic's true prize. Greenland today is not a pawn. It's a kingmaker. By embracing European environmental standards, welcoming Canadian investment, and asserting its own sovereignty, Greenland has charted a path that avoids dependency and resists domination. The nation has evolved from a distant territory into a sovereign player, holding the keys to some of the most critical resources of the 21st century. In the new Arctic order, investment is influence, and Canada has proven itself a master, not through force, but through partnership. Not with tanks, but with treaties, not with slogans, but with strategy. As global temperatures rise and the polar ice melts, Greenland's minerals will only grow more vital. Because in this game of Arctic chess, the quietest move turned out to be the most powerful one. Once again, thanks for watching this video. If you got something out of this, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. And hey, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Agree, disagree, or something in between. I'd love to hear it.